Rachel Reeves finds herself in a difficult situation. The economy is not doing well, with interest payments on borrowing hitting a 30-year high. The cost of borrowing soared to its highest level for more than a quarter of a century this week as gilt yields continue to rise. 30 months after the budget, the yield on 30-year gilts reached more than 5.25% on Tuesday for the first time since 1998, and today have ticked over 5.34%. Meanwhile, the yield on a 10-year gilt is up to 4.8%, the highest level since the financial crisis. The yield, which measures how much it costs the government to borrow, is now higher than after Liz Truss's mini budget, sparking fears it could push up the cost of borrowing for households and businesses too. Now, this has meant that Reeves is scrambling to raise funds, which she was left with a choice between cuts or tax rises. And the reason why she was left with this choice is because of a stupid fiscal rules. She can't raise taxes due to the promise that she said she wouldn't do that before the election. And given how the inheritance tax went down, she's not going to do that. So instead, she's decided to cut disability benefits. It is understood that Labour is planning significant cuts to disability benefits managed by the DWP as part of their strategy to alleviate market worries about their economic policies. High ranking individuals with Downing Street in the Treasury are of the belief that substantial reductions to the DWP budget are required, with PIP identified as a primary target for reform. Chancellor Rachel Reeves has directed civil servants to adopt a tough stance on spending, preferred departmental cuts over new tax hikes. Now, I just want to say that mainstream articles are framing this in a way that she has to make budget cuts to alleviate market worries. Of course, that framing is a load of bullshit. Currently, personal independent payment can provide up to £9,600 per year to assist those with disabilities and health conditions with additional expenses. However, there's been a notable rise in mental health related claims, with new monthly payments for anxiety or depressive disorders more than doubling from 2,200 in 2019 to 5,300 in 2023. Officials are now considering tighter restrictions on disability payment qualifications, particularly focusing on defining eligible mental health conditions more precisely and potentially requiring stronger medical evidence before approving claims. Now, the left predicted this. I mean, had Labour campaigned on raising taxes on the wealthy or a wealth tax, then they could have implemented those policies without losing political capital, since that was the promise before the election. And she can't increase spending without tax rises or cuts because she made, once again, her fiscal rules. This political failure has been entirely their own making. Tax increases certainly would have had the most negative impact in terms of their credibility, but cutting benefits is deeply immoral, although, I don't know, Labour hardly cares. Helena, um, in this situation, could have Rees dropped her fiscal rules? Obviously, that would damage her credibility, but isn't that the best option, given that she wasn't going to raise taxes and protect those on welfare with further cuts?
I think that the issue that she has is that if she'd never had the fiscal rules to begin with, all of her options would be open right here. There wouldn't be any need to look into spending cuts or tax rises. Not that I think the tax rises would be a bad thing. I think we need more taxes on the rich. But even if you just assume that it's politically impossible for Rachel Reeves to do tax cuts, to do tax rises or spending cuts, if you think that it's politically impossible for her to do both of those things, therefore she needs other options at her disposal, that's a reasonable position. That's the position I think at this point we are basically are at, that no one would really accept any more tax rises after a bunch of tax rises in the last budget. So what I think the problem she has is that she could break the fiscal rule. She could change the fiscal rule right now. But if in response to market panic, she just goes, oh, well, I'm just going to change the rules, the markets would certainly view that as something that would give them less trust, make them less sure of their investment in the UK economy. And that would only push gilt yields up further and therefore do further damage to our overall credibility, right? Market panic in response to somebody saying, oh, I'm just going to change the rules then. Whereas if she'd never had the rules in the first place, it wouldn't be a problem because she would just change her overall spending envelope and it wouldn't lead to a potential U-turn that would damage her credibility in the eyes of market people or those who are potentially out there trying to sell off gilts, right? The reason for the spike in the gilt yield is because there's been a sell-off. People are trying to sell these particular products. What happens when people are trying to sell a thing? The value of it goes down, therefore the interest payment on it needs to go up to satisfy investors that it's a good place to put their money if they think the value might go down over time. And that can lead, if things continue to sell off, to a kind of doom spiral that you see wherein the value of a currency goes low because people are trying to off-sell on the assumption that the price will be lower in future, therefore it's going to be not be a safe investment for them. Now, of course, there are plenty of things that we could cut that's not disability benefit too. We could be cutting things like Trident or military spending, for example. We could do these things, even if you wanted to do cuts. I don't think that we should, but we could do these cuts, and she's still not doing that. After Keir Starmer said we should be balancing the budget on the backs of the people with the broadest shoulders, I don't think disability is something that necessarily falls within that category. So this is just total abandonment of Labour's political principles. But she said that she wanted to be tougher than the Tories on benefits in 2014, and she is
Got her
doubling
wish.
down on those promises that she made all of those years ago. And this is especially galling since we now know from a report in the Guardian that these changes to disability payment that were being drafted by the Conservatives off of the advice of Ian Duncan Smith's think tank, the Centre for Social Justice, very ironically named, we now know from those leaks that there was never any intention that this was something that would be good for disabled people. It was all just being done for fiscal reasons. So there is zero justification for these cuts. Even after all of this, even if you accepted that the fiscal rules shouldn't change and that we shouldn't be doing tax rises and that we shouldn't be doing spending cuts, there are still options on the table as well. So one of the reasons why we're seeing a sell-off of bonds in the country is because the Bank of England is engaging in quantitative tightening. They are currently selling bonds at the same time, therefore increasing the supply, reducing the cost, and therefore increasing the yield. Like Rachel Reeves tomorrow could go to the Bank of England and say, Oi, Andrew Bailey, stop selling off bonds. Stop quantitative tightening right now. And he'd have to do it. The Bank of England Act specifically says that the Chancellor, if she thinks it's in the interest of the broader economy, can overrule the decisions of the Independent Bank of England. She could do that tomorrow. Just tell them to stop selling gilts. And this overall sell off that's increasing the yield might stop, would be more likely to stop. And she's not doing it because she's fundamentally wedded to the treasury brain that's plagued our economic decision making for the last 45 years. And yet she won't do that. She could tier the interest payments that we pay on reserves held by the Bank of England from their quantitative easing program. And she won't do that either, even though the European Central Bank already does this. There's plenty of precedent for this not being some kind of measure that would bring down an economy because it was fine when the ECB did it, yet Rachel Reeves won't do that either. So there's loads of options that she could be taking in terms of spending cuts elsewhere, tax rises, breaking the fiscal rules, or other kind of economic stuff in the background with regards to the Bank of England that she could be using as a way of mitigating these problems in the markets, other than going after the disabled. And she's choosing none of them and is breaking this very small promise that Keir Starmer made to balance the books off the back of the people with the broadest shoulders. And that is unforgivable.
I mean, it's remarkable how those like Rachel Reeves, who say they're the grown-ups in the room, they're the ones that understand what it's like to be in power, what it's like to be in government, don't understand that the problem with Liz Truss's budget was it's not the policy itself, it's the fact that it spooked the markets. And the markets are really the thing they care about the most is stability. I mean, that's why John McDonnell went to the City of London and said, look, we are going to increase taxation, but this is how this is our economic plan. We're going to use it to invest in the economy. And the markets wouldn't have spooked so much because he told them exactly what they were going to do. Now, when you go into an election saying we're committed to not increasing taxation, as you said, you're closing yourself off because you never know what's around the corner. Now, of course, for us, increase of taxation is more about reducing inequality. But even if you don't have that belief, or that sort of MMT belief, shall we say, keep your options open because it's far better to say, look, there's a possibility of tax rises than saying there's going to be no tax rises, and then that might be an option. In fact, it's better to go into a government, go into an election saying we're committed to tax rises on the wealthy, and then not do it, rather than saying we're probably not going to do it, and that's on the table. Betting markets now are actually apparently talking about Reeves being ousted. I mean, do you think that's a possibility? And if so, who do you think would be the likely successor? And if Keir Starmer was to do this, do you think that this is actually a good political move in a situation where they've, of course, painted themselves into a corner?
So I think it's first of all worth pointing out that with regards to Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, it was entirely self-inflicted. So the reason why that there was a problem for the economy was that the yields on gilt spiked overnight as a reaction to the budget, and a bunch of pension funds were over-leveraged in government bonds, so they got margin called, which almost led to a massive collapse in people's pension savings, which was then mitigated by a bond buying program from the Bank of England. So the comparisons between Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves, I think, are unfair in that one of the biggest things driving up bond yields in the UK right now is just America. Like they broadly track with US Treasury yields, and there's not much that Rachel Reeves can do about that other than engage, I guess, to ask Andrew Bailey to reverse quantitative tightening. So there's a lot of these problems with regards to the picture of the markets that is out of Rachel Reeves' hands, which isn't true in the same way as Liz Truss, regardless. So I think she's a little bit hard done by in terms of being blamed for the initial problem. What we should be blaming her for is how she reacts to that problem, right? In the same way that you can't blame the Conservatives for inflation happening when they were in government, because that was an international problem. But you can blame them for how they responded to it, which was again trying to stop us getting wage rises and advising the Bank of England to deal with problems in terms of too many wage rises, for example. And obviously their failure on energy policy that led to us being overexposed to a gas crisis happening because of the war in Ukraine as well. So that's the problem, is we're critiquing her for her reaction, not the fact that this has
Yes.
happened. That's really important to pin down on this. With regards to her potentially stepping down, now her approval ratings are really bad. She has some of the lowest approval of any politician in government at the moment. Does that mean she'll step down? Well, when was the last time that replacing a chancellor calmed markets? This
Mm.
isn't something that you can be able to look at in terms of how it affects the economy. And I think most Labour politicians are of the opinion that getting people to think that their living standards are going up is more important than whether or not they like the individual politicians. And I think there's merit to that. You know, like Kamala Harris's approval ratings went up when she got nominated to be the presidential candidate in America. But fundamentally, how popular she was or wasn't was never going to be as important to Americans as their material conditions, right? And that was the big thing that came out of the post-election polling. People cared about the economy. There was inflation when they were in government, and they got blamed for it. That's the
Mm.
thing, right? So they're looking at living standards as being the important part of their message moving forward. So I don't think we'll see Rachel Reeves get replaced. If she does, I think that it probably will be by Pat McFadden, which
Yeah,
is
that's
the
what I think it's
worst
gonna
decision possible because that
be. He's
man
terrible.
he's not only a charisma vacuum. I also think that he's well known to be somebody who's pretty high up in the Starmer Politburo, so that won't be a change of direction
Mhm.
in terms of policy whatsoever. Although Number 10 did put out a statement saying that Rachel Reeves will be Chancellor until the next election. I don't think that's wise because I think that somebody, maybe 2 years down the line, you try and get a fresh face in so that they can't be blamed on any economic problems that happen over the next year,
Yeah.
if that's true. So maybe that there is warranted for a change, but this quickly will do nothing to calm the markets and will probably make it look even worse. They'll think we're totally unstable if we're replacing people left, right, and centre. People do want stability, so Rachel Reeves probably will remain in post for now.
Yeah, I suppose it's not a trade-off between political capital and the state of the economy, because if you were to get rid of a chancellor within months, the economy would suffer for it because of the uncertainty. So I guess I mean, it's a fair comment. You're right. The best thing to do is probably to stick with her. I also agree with you. It is unfair to make the comparison between Liz Truss and Rachel Reeves. Don't think it's her fault, but of course it's the reaction to it. Now I was reading Richard Murphy's tax research website. I really like some of the stuff he's been saying. His view is that the government doesn't need gilts. I mean, he says basically it's a myth that we use them for borrowing. Of course, we know his macro policy is quantitative easing, and he is one of the biggest proponents of MMT. Also, a while back, I was listening to Unlearning Economics, and he does great work too. I think he was talking about UBI specifically, but he said that high spending isn't inflationary. Um, so I want to get your comment on what Richard Murphy has been saying, but also where did this idea that the policies of high amounts of investment or high spending increases inflation, because obviously this is in line with Rachel Reeves and most mainstream political parties adopt, hence why Rachel Reeves has the fiscal rules.
I mean, I think that one of the big things that MMT theorists will adhere to is that the fundamental purpose of government spending is to mobilize real resources in the economy. This is the fundamental fulcrum on which all economic policy should reside: is what real resources do you have at your disposal, and how can you use the fact that you are a sovereign currency issuer to mobilize those to maximize the economic output at that point. So that's when inflation happens, is where you put new money into the economy at full capacity. Is everyone being productive? Are all potential physical resources being mobilized through engaging in targeted investment? Like, that's what's important as far as I'm concerned about MMT, alongside replacing this idea that taxes fund government spending with government funds spending through the Bank of England through currency creation, and that currency is just taxed back and destroyed as a method of controlling the money supply to be able to ensure that we don't get demand driven inflation by getting to the point where the max amount of resources have been maximized. Now, I think this is a really good story about how the economy works, and I think it's fundamentally true, but it shouldn't really change your approach to policy, in the whether or not you're funding it through guilt or you're funding it through money creation or whatever it might be. Your increase in government spending
Yeah.
has to be used to mobilize resources. That's the fundamental part that I think is important about MMT as a theory, is looking at the real resources that you have, which is why fundamentally I think the fiscal rule that's being broken here is so stupid in the first place. The idea that from a mainstream Keynesian would be you can't deficit spend on day to day spending because that's not investment. Well, I mean, increased, I don't know, provision in the NHS by having NHS doctors and nurses paid high enough that you can bring in more staff to see more patients, which would bring the waiting lists down. That's a productivity increase. That will lead to more people being seen by the NHS and be able to getting back into work full time, which will increase productivity and mobilize real resources. This is classified as day-to-day spending by the government. And if we don't do that, we'll see an economic doom spiral. One of the biggest problems in our economy is the lack of people able to get out there and be productive because they're sitting on an NHS waiting list. But Rachel Reeves's own fiscal rules preclude her from deficit spending on things outside of physical investment in new infrastructure in the NHS, despite the fact that whilst that is necessary, other spending is also necessary to see people. So that would be a pro-growth measure that is precluded by her silly fiscal rules, and that is where the mobilization of resources as the fulcrum of how you do policy is important to me.
What Richard Murphy was saying though is that we don't need gilts because we can just fund everything. We don't need an income for it, so we don't need to borrow essentially. But at the same time, I guess it doesn't really matter though, because you're quite right that if you adhere to the MMT mindset, you don't really even need to change the policy. It is more of a story or narrative there. So even if you're borrowing through gilts, okay, there's interest you've got to pay back. But if you're someone who believes in the MMC theory, and I'm not saying as if I don't believe it, but I'm just it is an economic theory, then it kind of doesn't matter if you're paying interest on it because you can fund things anyway because we have a sovereign currency. I mean, I hope I'm not butchering his sort of argument there. I don't know if I've broadly
I
got that
think the
right or
difference. I think the difference between the two really is that if you're getting people repaying bond values, then that doesn't increase the money supply as quickly as printing new money,
yeah,
engaging in money creation would do directly. And whilst that may be absolutely fine and would have been fine in the 0% interest rates liquidity trap that the country was in from 2010 to 2020, perfectly a reasonable way of doing it. I think Richard Murphy was right to
yeah,
lobby John McDonnell to engage in what was called the people's quantitative easing, which is essentially money creation as a way of creating an investment bank and a way of investing in new businesses when the economy was essentially stagnant during the entirety of that period, where there wasn't enough investment in productive capital, in productive use of investment to create new businesses, to create new economic activity at that time, because people just taking new money from George Osborne's quantitative easing plan and throwing it into assets, just pouring liquidity into the property markets, into financial
yeah.
instruments, made wealthy people way more wealthy, increased growth because the value of assets was growing. Did that make things better for normal people? Well, no, it made it worse. The normal people aren't homeowners, they don't hold financial assets. Their assets were getting much less valuable in relation to the financial and property assets held by the super rich. So everybody was overall poorer in this country as a result, whereas productive investment would have been pro growth, would have not been inflationary, as the supply of goods and services would have been increasing in the economy due to that productive investment, and we would have seen a fairer economy. Now we're seeing the kind of inflation being kind of sticky, which is the point where under MMT theory, you stop the spending is when we see lots of inflation. That's where you want to rein in your government spending. And also, we're not just seeing levels of inflation, but we're also seeing a depreciation of the currency. If you then start printing more currency and you don't have a way of getting people to produce things that make people want to have your access to your currency to be able to buy your exported products, that can have a downward pressure on the currency and could see a shorting of the pound if you gauge it too much, like expansionary spending through money printing. That's where I would think there would be a problem if there's too much inflation, which might make inflation, or if you see the value of the pound decrease too much. Again, this could be in somewhat mitigated by having a better manufacturing sector, and that will require more investment. But it's a full problem that the UK economy has of being over financialized, in that we don't make anything, we were deindustrialized, people only want pounds to engage in our financial sector. So we have to essentially live off of this kind of three financiers in a trench coat economy within the city of London that then finances everybody else. And so if you had more regional equality, more manufacturing, I think that'd be a more credible policy moving forward.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.